Welcome to Voices of Experience, starting our 10th year, or finishing our 10th year, I should say. In the next half hour, we'll be looking at voting, our most precious right as citizens. Our country's government begins with the consent of the governed, and we give our consent through voting. We are honored today by having Secretary of State Mark Ritchie, Minnesota's chief election official, join us. Mark Ritchie was first elected Secretary of State in 2006. You were re-elected in 2010. You have also served as the national president of the Association of Secretaries of State. Mark, it's good to have you back.
Thank you very much for inviting me again.
Yeah. So the format for our half hour here, let's begin by looking at our most recent election, the 2012 election. Then we'll proceed to some specifics in Minnesota law, and then look at some ways that we can improve things and to help all citizens, and especially retirees. So on a traditional basis, Minnesota ranks at the top or very near the top in percentage of eligible citizens voting. Did that work out in 2012?
Yes, you're right. We're always at the top. Presidential years are, of course, the biggest, but year after year in national elections, Minnesota is always number one in terms of the turnout of our eligible voters. Mm-hmm. The number two state almost always was Wisconsin. Sometimes it's 5 or 6% behind Minnesota, mm-hmm. but we are the two top states in the country. And in the top 10 states, we share some similar policies, some laws, for example, Election Day registration. Mm-hmm. But Minnesota last year, again, was the top state in the nation. We actually had a record number of citizens voting. We had about 35,000 more people than we'd ever had in the past. And it was a very smooth election. I think our local election officials, the 4,000 precincts around the state where we hold elections, did an incredible job in handling a very, very large turnout of people. And as the number one voting state in the country, we also get a lot of scrutiny. And one of the things that was also very encouraging last year, made me very proud again of being Minnesota Secretary of State, is that we were ranked in the top for election administration as well.
Yeah, there was a Pew study on that, if I recall correctly. Yeah.
And it was based on our 2008 mm-hmm. and 2010 voting, and of course in 2012 we even had more improvements, and so we expect to again be at the top when they do their new ranking. But it's interesting, we are always careful to say that being number one in the nation is important, but it should just be a spur to be even better. To have the highest voting in the country, 76%, 78%, depending on the year, is great, but that's an average. When you're an average, that means that part of the state is voting above it, part of it voting below. For example, some parts of our state vote in the 90% range, mm-hmm. some parts of our state in the 50 and 60, and some of our citizens, let's say older voters, vote in a higher percent, mm-hmm. and some of our citizens, especially younger voters, especially if it's brand new, if they're just turning 18, vote below the average. So we need to be appropriately proud mm-hmm. of our accomplishment, but we also need to bear in mind that we can always do better, and we need to find ways to keep improving the system.
I can recall my own precinct in South St. Paul. We had a 99% voter turnout, with the same day voter registrations, and the city of Duluth, as a large city, having a fantastic turnout. Was it about 90%?
Yes, Duluth is very unusual in the nation. It's a little over 90%, and the whole northern part of the state is mm-hmm. Often in that 90% range in our presidential years.
Yeah, right. How many people registered to vote on election day in a typical election?
In the biggest election, so that's the presidential year, we have about 500,000 people who change their address. That's the number one thing. 3/4 to a little more than that are changing the address, or they're 18-year-olds, just turned 18, or they're individuals who are have come to our state, let's say to go to college or to work in a job here. So it's about 500,000. It depends. We are also, of course, having to do all the paperwork and the other clerical tasks that are associated with that. So we're always interested in trying to get as many people as possible to update their, let's say, their address beforehand.
Yeah.
You have about 3/4, let's say, of the 500,000, about 300,000 are just changing their address. Probably they have, in many instances, changed the address on their driver's license. And there's a simple way to just mark a box when you're making that change. And that way it could be done automatically, and then you don't have to go through that second process.
As a matter of fact, I changed my address yesterday, and I got my new driver's license.
So you just moved.
And we just moved, and I looked at the bottom of the driver license form. There's a thing there for voter registration. I
Yes.
said, yes.
And you know, we wish it was a little bit bigger.
Yeah,
and
small print.
It was small print, and when you're older, small print is a challenge. But we're looking forward to even improving that system. Of course, we're moving towards more digital everything.
Yeah.
So it's possible, and Delaware has done this. You have a big screen, you're getting your driver's license, you're making sure the new address is correct. Have a screen pop up that says, hey, you have just updated your driver's license. Your voter registration is at a prior address. Would you like to update your voter registration? You hit a button, yes. It populates a form. It pops up. Is all of this correct? If so, hit yes. You know, you swear all your oath, hit yes, and then it's done. And so one of the nice things is that with the new digital technologies, it's possible over time to help really reduce the time it takes for you or for any voter to go through the two-step process. Let's say you need to register on election day, but also you can avoid not just the time of clerical entry and data entry, that kind of stuff, but also errors when you're typing. And some of us scribble when we write. Our handwriting maybe never was very good, but probably it's not as good now as it might have been. And so we know that there are things like that that we can do that can make things better, and we're working on that now.
The driver's license clerk, we gave her our address, she entered it in the computer, and then she read it back to us to make sure it was
customer service.
Yeah.
You know, it's very important that we get real precision.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we're constantly talking about in the world of election administration is ways to, let's say, make good use of what we already know. For example, you're having to stand in line for this, stand in line for that, register for this, register for that. Is there some way that there's a possibility of merging and having some access? For instance, folks might not change their driver's license, or many people don't have driver's license. That's just the way it is. But they might go in and change their postal address at the post office. Our Office of Secretary of State got authority from the legislature to use that change of address information to notify citizens who've moved, and saying with a little postcard, hey, we've noticed that you've recently updated or changed your address through the U.S. Postal Service. As a service, we will update your voter registration, but we want to make sure from you that, you know, this information is correct, this is what you intended to do. But that's an example of taking advantage of somebody already stood in line once to do that. Can we use that to make the whole process better?
So now I am registered in my new place. Do I have to register again in 5 years or 10 years, or I'm registered?
As long as you continue to vote once in each 4 years in that presidential cycle, you remain what we call active. If you in some way lose your right to vote, or if you renounce your citizen, you know, they're different things. They're a little unusual. But you will stay on that voting list as long as you can continue to vote once every 4 years. If for some reason, let's say you missed election one time and you were sick another time, you thought, well, I'll go. But, things happen.
Yeah.
Things happen in life. Then we urge people to double check. And we built an online tool this last year so that you can go up and make sure not only that you're registered, but that the address where you're registered is your proper address. And we're working to complete that process so that you could go in and make that change yourself based on building a system. But you are, as long as you're voting, you stay on the list. But these are all machines. We're all humans. We always urge people to double check.
Yeah. Now let's get back to the 2012 election for a bit. How many absentee ballots were cast, approximately?
Yeah, we typically have about 10%. I think it was around 300,000.
Okay.
You have overseas absentee ballots. You have overseas what we call military and military family ballots. You have domestic mail-in absentee ballots, and you also have in Minnesota what we call the in-person absentee. You go down to your city clerk's office, county courthouse, and fill in the paperwork and vote that way.
Is that 10%? Is that fairly stable number, give or take?
No, actually, it's interesting. When we look nationwide, almost every state in the country, you see the trend of people, their busy lives, their school and work and family, pushing them to look for ways to vote in a time period instead of just on Tuesday, that's election day. So you have more and more people voting by mail, by absentee, even in Minnesota. We passed a law that gave permission to some townships. So townships are the smallest unit of government, typically in rural areas. There are 4,000 polling places in the state, jurisdictions, roughly. About half of those, roughly, are townships. We allow townships, if they are 400 voters or less, to vote all by the U.S. Postal Service mail. Many states do this already, Washington, Oregon, 100%. But in Minnesota, we have about 500 of those smaller townships who've made that choice. But what we see is a trend that because of the way our lives are organized, people are looking for those alternatives. And there is legislation pending to clarify some of those rules and to help people. Because in the United States, generally speaking, east of the Mississippi, the states have moved to systems called early voting. They have places called vote centers that are typically, let's say, in a shopping mall or some student place. And you can go 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever, to a place. They have all the styles of ballots, and you can vote, basically between 8 and 5 and some weekends.
So that's early voting.
Yeah. West of the Mississippi, many states have gone to all vote by mail, which is its own form of early voting, depending on the state. But by national law, we have to give our absentee voters, our military and other overseas absentee voters, a minimum of 45. In Minnesota, it happens to be 46 days. So these two trends, Minnesota's kind of in the middle. We have a mix of all postal mail voting in our smaller townships. We have in-person absentee voting, which some people sometimes call early voting. And we have lots of proposals from the local election officials to move to a system that is a true form of early voting. If you're going to come in and in-person absentee vote, you could have the choice to say, and I would like it processed right now so I don't have to remember or think about it. It just gets done.
Under current law, and this is before the 2013 state legislature has adjourned.
Correct.
So under current law, what are the what is the criteria for getting an absentee ballot?
Well, so Minnesota is a kind of a curious, odd set of rules about absentee voting. If you're overseas in the military, it's essentially, you can not just request a ballot, you can even get the ballot sent to you electronically, so you can print it out, and that you have very special rules. If you are resident of the United States or resident of the state, you have to provide an excuse to say why. But most Minnesotans have years ago realized that was kind of that there was no rule, no description, no penalty, no nothing that provided any shape. One of the things is out of my precinct on election day.
Yeah.
Does that mean 1 foot outside of my precinct for 1 minute on my election day? Or does it mean I'm in Paris or Bolivia or Miami?
Yeah.
It has been the case that most of the rest of this nation, the United States, has long abandoned this notion of you must have an excuse for absentee voting, and they've gone to no excuse absentee voting.
Okay.
The Secretary of State in Ohio mailed absentee ballot applications to every voter in Ohio. Many states, many state political parties, for example, the Minnesota Republican Party had a mailer to their strong supporters saying, vote early. It's very important to vote. Voting is an important right. Vote early. What they meant was, of course, absentee vote.
Yeah.
And the use of the term vote early is confusing because, in fact, voting early is illegal in Minnesota. We don't allow early voting, but we have so much awareness that our citizens are busy people.
Yes.
With families, with school, with kids, with everything. And so we are very aware that a political party and everyone who's interested in getting people out to the polls have been encouraging their supporters or the citizens as a whole to get out and vote. And we are seeing that people want to choose some of those alternatives like the in-person or some other. And the legislature itself is looking at taking away and joining the rest of the nation with no excuse absentee. There's a proposal to allow any township that so chooses to use the U.S. Postal Service, and there are proposals to allow citizens who are choosing the in-person absentee to say, and I would like to process it right now, what you would call true early voting. They're in the clerk's office, they filled in their ballot. Instead of folding it up, putting inside a safety envelope, putting it inside an outside envelope, filling in a lot of paperwork, turning it over, and all of that expensive bureaucracy, they want the peace of mind of filling in their ballot privately, walking over to the machine, putting it in, and then have the peace of mind of knowing it's done.
Does the Office of Secretary of State have any way of tracking how many people over age 65 vote, or is that done through separate polling information?
Well, we don't specifically look for this information, but for instance, there are exit polling firms.
Yeah.
Minnesota has not been as targeted as we had been in the past.
Right.
There's a little bit of information, but people can rent from the Office of Secretary of State the list of registered voters and the information that they participated in the election is known information. Primary election,
Right.
general election, and birth date.
Yeah.
So you could provide an analysis if you knew roughly how many senior citizens there were, and the Census Bureau does some estimates.
Yeah.
You could construct a kind of a data analysis and take a look at it as a kind of overall factor.
Now, the state of Minnesota is known as the land of 10,000 lakes, and some people have suggested the land of 10,000 recounts.
Oh,
We don't want to spend the next 2 hours on recounts, but do you have any comments about recounts? Did we have any in 2012?
sure. Well, keep in mind we always have recounts.
Oh, okay.
Always recounts. Minnesotans are an active people, and recounts just happen. Typically, they are in local races. Sometimes elections are exact ties. In Minnesota, we flip a coin. In Texas, they play blackjack.
Oh, really?
But in 2008, we had a couple coin tossed. One time up in a town up on the Iron Range, I think Gilbert, Good Morning America or the Today Show came out and broadcast. So close elections happen. Typically, they're local, and we always have 2, 3, 4, maybe 12, but local, county, city council. Every once in a while, we'll have a big statewide recount. And we had one in the 1930s, I believe, state auditor. We had one in 1962, which actually is the big one in Minnesota.
That's when I came to Minnesota.
Rolvog, Anderson, it basically set the rules that we operate under today. It was a very close election, took a long time, but I think Minnesotans felt like that was a process that we learned. And then we have had 3 since I was elected. 2 that are fairly well known, one in the governor's race in the last election, one in the Senate race in 2008, but also in 2008 in the primary election for now Chief Justice Gilday. There was a primary in September, for that election, and there was a recount in that. So large-scale recounts that are statewide are rare, but I have had 3. We typically, the state, the taxpayers agree to pay for recounts when it's within 0.5%. That's a trigger.
That was my next question, the trigger.
A candidate
can
1% ask for a recount any day, all elections, but they have to pay for it. But Minnesotans, I think, especially our election officials, believe that we could make that trigger for spending taxpayer money a little closer and not waste money. And so there's a proposal moving through the legislature to make it 1/4% the taxpayers would pay for it. If it's above 1/4%, there still can be a recount any day, but the candidate would need to pay for it. Some states have as close as 0.1%. So we feel very comfortable that 1/4% paid for by the taxpayers would be very appropriate, and also reduce the exposure of particularly it's cost our local units of government, but it costs taxpayers in general. So we believe there will always be close elections. We hope there'll always be strong participation. But we do think that 1/4% is a better choice and could save taxpayers quite a bit of money depending on the circumstance.
Now, one item we haven't talked about is a primary election, one that narrows candidates down to 1 from each major political party to appear on the ballot in November. When do we have primary elections in Minnesota now, and how long have we had that, and what kind of changes are being considered?
So Minnesota's primary election, which is used for the 3 major parties, individuals who running independently or from the smaller parties go on the ballot based on collection of signatures. So that's moved around over the years, and a couple years ago the federal government, in response to the suggestion by the Department of Defense that if our soldiers were going to get a chance to vote, they needed to get their ballots early enough, the federal government passed a requirement that we'd have at least 45 days before an election of when a ballot would go out to one of our soldiers or overseas voters. Now, Minnesota had passed legislation to help our soldiers vote. It had been vetoed, so this was, after that, there was pressure from the federal government. So in order to send out the final ballot to our soldiers and others serving overseas 45 days before the general election, so figure that your general election is around the 1st of November. 45 days in advance would be around the middle of September. The ballot would need to be mailed. That means that we needed to have our primary election in August to meet that federal timeline. And so the election for the primary for the candidates of each of the big parties, the three major parties, is now currently in August.
Okay. And there are some people who would like to have that earlier.
Yes, there's some people who would like to have it later. There's some people who would like to have it earlier.
Okay.
We've had it twice. We had very high turnout the first time. We had relatively low turnout the second time, and that reflected that there was a hot race, a governor's race the first time, and there was essentially no races the second. I think the legislature is in a very serious consideration of moving that date, and we'll see how that works out. A lot of people have expressed one deep concern in that if you move the primary right up to June, so it's right after the legislative session, that if you're a sitting legislator and you have a challenge inside your party, a primary challenger, that's been the case the last few years. You've had a lot of challenges in some instances, that you might be worried about the fact that you're at the legislature, you're not able to knock doors and do their normal campaigning, especially if you're from the Iron Range or from way south. And more importantly, that if a contentious or controversial issue comes up in the legislative session, you might feel not comfortable about voting against the wishes of the most active people in your political party, because very soon after the session is over, the legislative session, those activists in your political party will be going to the primary. And so the older legislators who've been around a long time argue very eloquently that having the primary in August, as it is now, or September, allows the emotions to calm down some. And that if you have it in June, right after the legislature is over, you may have less ability of courageous leadership because people are worried about that challenge inside their party.
I meant to ask one question before, and you had another reference to it. On absentee ballots, do they have to be received by Election Day, or is it okay if they're just postmarked?
No, all ballots, mail-only ballots or absentee ballots or in-person absentee ballots have to be received before the last shipment of mail on Election Day. So it's very important.
Yeah, so that timeline is
different states have different rules. Our rule is it has to arrive on or before Election Day.
Another election matter, which we have to save for another show, is dealing with the whole question of changing the Constitution of Minnesota. We had a couple proposals that were defeated last go around 2012. That Labor was very happy about the fact.
Well, it's very interesting
that they were defeated.
Yeah, I think on another show it would be interesting to talk about how did we get the current rules under which a proposal to change the Constitution is made, because that goes back to our founding, and what are the proposals that the legislature is considering to make it so that it's not so easy to try to manipulate the Minnesota Constitution. There's some very serious proposals that'll be considered this year and next year to change how changes to the Constitution are made and how they're considered. So that'd be a great topic for another show.
Very, very good. So our award-winning director, Roger Carlson, and his crack all-retiree crew, Ed Rapp and Larry Chadwick, have told me that we have about 30 seconds left to go right now. So thank you, Mark Ritchie, for serving the people of the state of Minnesota as Secretary of State and for being on our program. Voting is an extremely valuable right, and one that we do and that we should take very seriously. People need to give their consent to be governed. Voices of Experience has been brought to you for 10 years now by the Minnesota State Retiree Council in connection with Minnesota AFL-CIO. Thank you for watching.